we'll have Ben Sweeting and John Goodbun talking about towards a typology of circularities.
Okay, one microphone. Do I need to use the microphone? Okay, hi. Like that? Like that? You can hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay, hi everyone, my name's Ben. I'm from the UK. I work at a university called the University of Brighton in the Architecture and Design faculty. And I've been involved with ASC for about 15 years, one way or another, so it's great to see those of you I haven't seen in person for a long time. And joined today by my colleague John Goodbun. John, do you want to just say a few words about yourself?
Say a few words, yeah, thank you. Well, I should say what a pleasure it is to be here. This is actually my first ASC conference, although I've been working on Bateson for close to 2 decades now. I haven't actually been here before, although the organisation and many of you here have been incredibly important to my development, so it's an absolute pleasure to be here. I'm based at the Royal College of Art in London. I'm also from an architectural background on the environmental architecture programme, and with a deep basis in Bateson's work, I guess.
Okay, so we're going to just go back and forth a bit. This is not an overly planned session. We've got a kind of loose structure. As it goes on, there's a bit less structure and a few more images, I'd say.
And I should probably say that I'm incredibly...
Yeah.
Is that on? Yeah. I'm suffering appallingly from jet lag right now, so I'm gonna... The concept was Ben's anyway on the whole, so he will be leading it, but also I'm declining.
So if John starts to kind of look a bit sleepy, then I think just to moderate that, feel free to just put your hand up and come in at any point, especially towards the second half. I would really appreciate that. I'm going to stand a bit to the side, I think. Is that good? Okay, so this is maybe starting in a slightly different place than questions of archiving and history, but actually I've kind of got a bit of a transition. I was actually doing some archival research yesterday in the Library of Congress. I just kind of popped over there. It's incredibly easy and wonderful to use that space, amazingly accessible. And they have Margaret Mead's archive. So I was looking at, one of the folders I was looking at was the folder that has, over here, yeah, that better? The folder that relates to the first conference, the ASC, in 1967. And there's a folder with not just the notes she was looking at before giving her opening remarks, but also some of the transcripts, right? And the transcripts and editing them, and there's some different parts in them that are published. And this is one bit which I thought I'd share with you. So I think this is edited out of the published version, and we'll use this to begin. So I had a very curious experience a couple of weeks ago of getting on a plane with a young man after I'd used the word cybernetics in a lecture. He said, I don't know what that means. And a little later I asked him what he did, and he was a computer specialist. Now, of course, he didn't mean he couldn't have a dictionary definition, but he did mean that he didn't know what I was talking about when I was talking of a way, in the way I was talking about cybernetics as a way of looking at things, or a kind of language. And I think that could be written now, right? I don't know if anyone was talking to a man on a plane, used the word cybernetics, and had a bit of difficulty explaining on the way here. Sometimes happens. And I was struck by the call for papers for the conference around a glossary. And I thought, what do I want from a glossary? So for me, a glossary is something that I might use to help me understand what I'm hearing that everyone else is saying. and also to help me understand what I'm hearing when I'm saying things. So sort of listening to myself or understanding myself. In particular, it might help me with the differences between things that are related. So it might help me with, how and when to draw a distinction, or to undraw a distinction, or to say that things are the same, or to say how things that are the same are different, and so on. One of the things I could do with, sort of help with, in understanding cybernetics, is really understanding some of the nuance around some of the key concepts. So in particular, focus on today the concept of circularity. I want to connect this to the problem of introducing cybernetics, right? So it means problem here. And I think it's always good to sort of feel like you're new to cybernetics. I don't know if anyone's completely new to cybernetics or fairly new today. I feel like I always want to, or the more I go on, the newer I feel. And, there's so much of it, it's so varied. The way people talk about it is so different. And in part, there's a difficulty of sort of explaining it that you can say is part of its fragmentation as a discipline. So it sort of exists, or we think it exists in a certain period in a very coherent way. And then it sort of gets broken up. And some people would take that as a requirement or a prompt to have a better definition, right? A tighter definition of its scope and purposes. Some people might be originalists and insist that it's exactly how Venus said it was, or so on and so forth. But I'm not convinced by that. So in particular, it seems to me that structurally, cybernetics is hard to define. Go to the next one. So I don't think it's just that cybernetics is difficult, right? Difficult to introduce. It's not just because it's fragmented. It's partly because of that. It's partly that it's kind of unusual. But I think it's resistant to definition. So in some senses, it's kind of ambiguous in how it relates to all the other disciplines, right? So I think how everyone, like I'm from architecture and John's from architecture, so I think we read it maybe in a certain way that's kind of similar from our background. I don't know if you think that. But when people come from, I think it's really how people understand it. Maybe your background's really coming into what you find in it. It also crosses the disciplines really quickly. It also crosses contexts, right? So it sort of moves quickly from one place to another place. It also moves between things, so the concepts are circularities that kind of, they're not just the ones in my body, they're the ones between my body and this room and the planet and so on. So it's kind of hard to get a definition on it. So, 1 minute you're talking about a pond, the next minute you're talking about a factory, right? 1 minute you're, trying to understand how you're drinking a cup of tea. The next minute someone's designing an anti-aircraft system. 1 moment you're kind of understanding your brain waves. The next minute you're kind of making electronic music. So it jumps all over the place. And I think this is part of it, what's interesting, right? If it didn't jump all over the place, it maybe would be less relevant. But that means that the ideas and terms move from original context, and they don't continue to mean what you might expect them to mean, right? So, if there's words like homeostasis that have a context, but we don't use them in that context in cybernetics. It's sort of moved. This just makes it kind of hard to introduce. There's also a political aspect of that. So when the words jumped context, the politics have changed. I don't think we track that very well. So if you think of something like homeostasis or resilience, I'm thinking about my blood sugar. I'm diabetic. Think about my blood sugar. I've maybe got one attitude to the maintenance of essential variables. When I'm thinking about society, maybe I should be thinking about it a bit differently.
Just to say,
I would add.
turning this on or off?
Yeah.
I would add organic to that. I think we can have some discussion about that. What a complicated term that is. I don't know if you. Oh no!
Sorry, I'll just get that. Yeah.
Was that the remote?
Okay.
It was the remote.
So one of the
Or something.
this actually. Yeah. So one response to that, which I think is really kind of a common way of introducing cybernetics, is you kind of give it a history. I'm not really thinking about the kind of history, but a kind of introductory history, right? So often it's how it was kind of introduced to me. It's how I hear it being introduced in my experience of listening to other people introduce it. That often, begins with a kind of kickoff point, which might be the Macy conferences. It might be Norbert Wiener's book. It might be everything that's published in 1943. You start with somewhere. You then sort of describe a narrative. And I think that's quite effective, right? So I think that works, it situates everything, but there's some limitations. So I think it tends to emphasize some particular dominant figures, mostly men. That's kind of, that's noticeable in how cybernetics gets introduced. I think using history as a sort of quick introductory narrative also gives you a kind of, not a very rich history often. So it tends to lose a bit of the granularity that's interesting about history. I think also it becomes really situated in particular traditions, let's say. So you can give more than one history of cybernetics. I think at the conference 10 years ago, Albert Muller gave a paper, or his paper in the proceedings was called Advocan S, yeah? Histories of Cybernetics, histories with an S. So there's more than one history going on. And we're not telling all of those. So when we sort of use history as an introduction, it reinforces a particular history of the many histories. But most of all, I think it has worked quite well as a way of introducing, but the more history you get, the longer your introduction becomes. So at this particular point, maybe it begins to become a bit unwieldy in some way. That's because it gets longer, but it's also because the telling of historical narratives also has a history, which we heard a bit of, right? So you have to start telling the history of that history, history of that history of that history, and so on, which I think is really important, but again, it's just not such a great introduction, right? So as an alternative, well, another way of doing it is you just jump right in there, right? So you get this a lot. Why don't we just dive in with the viable system model, put the diagram up there with conversation theory, the ecology of mind, autopoiesis, all of them at the same time. Are they the best places to start? Well, actually, these are all pretty, they're kind of complicated. Maybe as an introduction, maybe interesting question right now. So what about introducing cybernetics through its core ideas? This for me is the thing that maybe I imagine the glossary being. Circularity or circular processes is maybe one of those. I don't mean to make it everything, but it's certainly like one core idea that you could introduce things through. The Macy conferences as a potential sort of starting point have it in their, I think, still quite useful title, Circular Causal and Feedback Mechanisms in Biological and Social Systems. Now there's many forms of circular processes, and I think some of them are more prominent in cybernetics than others. And what I'm sort of want to prompt today, I don't have like a, this is how it, this is the way to think about it kind of talk, but I want to prompt maybe, how do we want to distinguish between different kinds of circular processes or forms of circular processes? When do we want to distinguish it? When do we not want to distinguish it? And so on. This thing. So I'm going to kind of run through some. I hope this sort of doubles as a kind of form of introduction if you're new to all this today as well. And also, just invite anyone to jump in at any point, because I'm sort of, asking for help in a way. So first one I think is feedback. Feedback's a circular process. There's something about difference that's important in it. So that, I guess the easiest example is something like the thermostat. So your heater and your thermostat, the heater controls the thermostat controls the heater, you control the setting, or don't control the setting. The key driver is a difference, so if it's really hot, hopefully your heater goes off. If it's not very hot, hopefully the heater comes on. And you get a kind of system that's governed by a difference, or sometimes an error. If you don't like it, it's called an error. And often that's talked about in two kinds, a positive kind and a negative kind. Interestingly, the positive kinds are usually the ones you don't want. So positive is increasing difference, like a runaway curve, which would be the microphone feedbacking is an example of that. So the speaker being picked up by the microphone amplifies and it just accelerates all the time. Negative is one where the difference is decreasing, so that's like the thermostat heater. You also sometimes get a feedback, feed-forward distinction. When you use that distinction, it's often talking about whether the difference is something that's being corrected or the difference is in a model about anticipating what's coming. And not everyone would use that distinction. I think people talk about it as this feed-forward thing is maybe implicit in feedback, but some people would use that, and people talk about that in teaching, trying to write things that are anticipatory rather than just correcting people's work. You also get kind of combinations of these. I think these have kind of forms as well. So I just got a couple examples. This one, so just a couple of quotes for these. This is a Gregory Bateson talking about a forest, or a forest typing ecosystem in 1967 at the Dialectics of Liberation conference in London. So describing here, all the creatures and the plants in the forest have a kind of runaway capacity. So they have they can produce more offspring. Those offspring can produce more offspring, and so on. They all have the potential to kind of go on a sort of exponential curve of growth. And then it's quite a thing to try and then create a kind of equilibrium. So you have all kinds of negative feedback or balancing feedback that puts all of those things into a kind of relation. And then if you disturb it, so you kind of knock out a particular insect or a particular bird, it's all going to go out of whack. It'll proceed along an exponential curve for a bit until something else kicks in and it balances off. I don't know if you want to add anything on that, John?
I'm beginning to fade. I always visualise the different curves you have with this, I guess. That negative feedback is characteristically something like a sine curve, right? As it's moderating itself and the others run off. It's also a useful quote, although we haven't been focused on Bateson, so I said that the runaway capacity is in all living systems. It's not kind of originally evil of humans as such. But the question is, what is it that's amplifying that? What's the we might be wanting to reflect upon?
Then this is a different kind of. So that's a combination, right? So we just had a kind of corrective structure, balancing feedback loop, balancing out an exponential one. This is a different one. This is a little bit later. So this is 1968, and this is in a paper that is introducing a conference he ran called The Moral and Aesthetic Structure of Human Adaptation. That's the next year. And here he's describing something else. Indeed, the very errors that we would set out to correct, the people in the conference, cultural errors of reductionism and mind-body separation, are themselves buttressed by homeostatic mechanisms. We were in agreement that to try to alter any variable in a homeostatic system without awareness of the supporting homeostasis must always be short-sighted and perhaps immoral. Yet we boldly go out and attack epistemological errors which are deeply rooted in our culture and supported by complex vested interests of all branches of that culture. So what he's talking about there is, we have kind of runaway processes like, say, the extortion of the environment through Western society and assumptions about how capitalism works and assumptions about how it should work. So this is a kind of runaway. But actually that runaway is reinforced by a whole set of homeostatic processes, right? So it's not just we have a runaway system, we have a bunch of homeostatic processes that are maintaining it. Okay. So how they're arranged also has a kind of form. Okay, so that's the first lot. And so there's a few different things there, like different kinds of feedback type process, different ways they could be arranged. And some people would say that that's sort of cybernetics, right? Cybernetics is concerned specifically with error control feedback. And I think there's other kinds of circular processes. And it's kind of interesting to talk about those too. So I'm just going to run through some, and there could be more. Peter, did you want to come in?
Yeah, if you're open to,
to just a reflection on how circularity looks to people that are not cybernetic thinkers, is that when you have positive reinforcement up to, reinforcing a trend, such as Piketty's financial model of capital returns to capital, it looks linear to people that aren't cybernetic thinkers. So they don't know what we mean by circularity when we're thinking about how that's reinforced. They're thinking things normally go up. It's just linear, it's a line, it's a slope. I mean, how is that a circle? They don't, because we're already thinking about the mechanism. So there's a disconnect there, and also with error, we'll think about the thermostat. Probably the same normal way of looking at that as a control system is that's also linear. It's like Paul had said, it's on or off. It's kind of so there's this gap in what we mean by circularity, where people are probably thinking, are you going to get to the point in this, which is actually circular conversation, which is, I will come back to that point after, I touch on a couple points of history, and then we'll come back. So when we talk in a circular way as well, it makes sense to circular thinkers. So I'm just saying that it looks linear to normies, right?
So I'm going to just run through some sort of other circular sort of processes. So the first one, I thought, just following on from the feedback one, I think we should kind of think about what's the same and what's the different to the kind of feedback processes described in system dynamics. So this is a kind of different but similar kind of field. It also has positive and negative feedback loops. I think, again, someone could help me here, but I think there's a difference between emphasizing stocks and flows, which is sort of the typical system dynamics thing. So you have, more predators lead to less praise, and less praise lead to less predators, and so on. I think there's a difference between emphasizing the kind of quantity and emphasizing a difference or an error. I think that's a different way of constructing a diagram. I think you could construct a feedback diagram based around error and based around quantity, and you get a slightly different way of talking about it, at least. Now, one of the things interesting about this system dynamics body of work is they have kind of diagramming language. They're quite good at talking about the combinations, and they have, you can find a whole set of things like this under the notion of archetypes. This is fixes that fail, which, as someone who works in a British university, something that's dear to me. So you have a kind of, you have a fix, but it has a unintended consequence on the delay that exacerbates your system even though you think you fixed it, right? So the whole set of things, kind of interesting thinking here about maybe how we might describe, describe combinations of circular systems. Another kind, this is the one I'm most confused at, so I'm sort of definitely looking around for help here, but there's a kind around recursion, and for me, I just hear recursion, and I just hear different things when people use it. So, are there different kinds? I think the key thing is a kind of loop. It's sort of implicit in the thermostat kind of example and the microphone example. You get processes that, hang on, before I get to that one, you get a loop. Here we have, does anyone know Doctor Who? Is that too British a reference? Yeah. Is it okay? So, you know, you have this amazing kind of introduction, which is a kind of video feedback. And that is a kind of beautiful version of the microphone thing, where the input is going into the output's coming into the input or whatever. It's forming a loop. It gives you these amazing patterns, right? These kind of recursive patterns. So that's one kind. I think you also have processes that transform themselves when they're happening. So the non-trivial machine, maybe the nervous system. So something that when you're doing it, the way it does things becomes different. So it sort of acts on itself. I think that's a slightly different structure than the Doctor Who structure. I think you get maybe self-reference here, maybe. So a process that includes a description of itself. And sometimes you get sort of nesting or hierarchical nesting described as a recursion. So in viable systems model, people talk about levels of recursion, because every bit in the complicated VSM diagram down here is also the whole diagram. And that feels like a different sort of thing, right? But to me, that's a kind of structural thing. It's a bit different from maybe some of those other processes.
Yeah, I would like to answer one of your questions.
Yeah, please do.
Okay.
I'd love that.
Yeah.
Sorry, would you? Yeah.
There are dramatically different kinds of processes that get labeled recursion. The worst case is in Chomsky linguistics, where they use simply the repetition of a process is recursion. And he'll make proclamations about what's competence and what's performance and so on. But if you actually look at the examples where he says, well, look, here's a process, a grammatical construction that perfectly straightforwardly demonstrates that people are really good at recursion and they have no problem with it at all. And here's something else, blah, blah. But every example that he says people have no problem with, and people have no problem with it, is tail recursion. I saw Jack and Fred and Mary and Chuck. My dad's brother's cousin's mom is my teacher. You don't have any problem with that because you're doing all of that on a single level. You're just linking. Whereas the cat ate the malt. The cat, the rat, the dog chased, killed, ate the malt. The cat, the rat, the dog chased, kicked, killed, ate the malt. Those are impossible beyond level 2. Actually, in highly cultivated medieval Arabic poetry, people can train themselves by memorizing and reciting and composing poetry to get all the way down to level 3, and actually even with enough attention and enough keef, follow the speaker in a new poem and get down to level 3. People can't do it. Why? Because you need a stack to do center recursion or left recursion. But right recursion is built into the brain. It's just stretch it across the surface of your perceptual cortex to see the events, or through semantic space by tracing familial or other relations. Thanks.
Thank you, that was really helpful. Yeah, please.
I mean, for me, recursion in computation is you get an answer to an equation and that gets fed back into the, I don't know which one, if that fits into any of those, but that's sort of my, that gets used by artists all the time, that process.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah,
So what is the role of, so when you talk about levels, I'm thinking about emergence.
Yeah.
Like, so do we want to talk about where that fits in here? that should be.
Can I say something about
Let's come
recursion?
back.
Well, yeah, it
Let's
seems
come
like
back to that.
recursion and
Yeah.
emergence, are they not
Yeah, that's great.
together, like you get one from the
Yeah.
other?
Yeah, that's
Back
great.
and- yeah. Thank you.
Huh.
There's also the non-iterative aspect of recursion where the structure supports itself through the way that it interacts with itself.
Recursion, never, always, what's the recursion? Always back on self, yet never quite the same.
Yeah, I like this definition, and for me, recursion is difficult concept to understand because there is no end.
Thanks, everyone.
No.
Okay, I'm gonna jump a bit here. Yeah.
Isn't there any recursion? Recursion doesn't exist only if we define it, only if we start to talk about it, and you define it in a different way than you, and I think the problem is that we still here also try to find what really is.
Thank you.
And I would say cybernetics, we don't have one definition, but cybernetics can explain why we can't define or why we can't find a final, an objective definition of cybernetics.
Yeah, yeah.
I don't know what
There's
is,
probably
but
more
I know
we
what I
could-
think.
Go on. I'm just going to throw some other things in here now. Right, so the circular economy, don't know if you work with this, this is a common thing in design. This is what we might think about the things we make things of, the things we make of things becoming things we make other things of, right? So this is, in the top right here, this is a building designed by one of my colleagues in Brighton, Duncan Baker-Brown, made entirely of waste material. So it's made of things that other buildings and other things in the city used to be made of. You can see there kind of funny banners. So these are all posters that used to be up temporarily for festivals in the city. I probably walked past quite a lot of them. And you can actually, they're single use, but you can use them as vapor control layers in a building, right? So there's a whole kind of process of trying to move the building industry away from an extractive model where we go and make some new materials and turn it into a circular model. Now, you might think, well, that's just materials. Cybernetics is about information and organization. That's a different thing. But you can look. Sorry.
I said it's embodied. That I think of cybernetics as an embodied version of systems thinking. Yeah.
So I think we can talk about that cybernetically. And the way I would do it would be to think of this as a kind of organizational thing. So here, all that waste is organized to make a building. That's a different organization than making a rubbish heap, right? And then we can take it apart, which changes its organization, and you can put it together again. That's what Ashby called constraint, if you look in Ashby's introduction. So those things are constrained in particular ways. You can unconstrain them and reconstrain them. And that's a kind of process which is moving between different parts and wholes, and it has a circular form. That's a different way of describing the circular form than the way that's typically done, right? Which is typically about moving material things in circles in the economy. I think that's actually similar to something like hermeneutics. So people who want to talk about hermeneutic circles sometimes say, and this is really different to a cybernetic circle, but I think hermeneutics is an oscillation between a part and a whole. It comes from originally how to interpret the Bible. You look at first of all, you start with the easy bits, then you use the easy bits to try and work out what the whole means, then all the context, and then you use that to do the difficult bits. So you're sort of oscillating between part and whole as a way of interpretation. And maybe there's something about that, and I don't know how you're feeling. Yeah, maybe a kind of dialectical form as well.
Well, partly just in reference to some conversations that were starting earlier about the different histories or the wider histories, and so something I've been very interested in is a reading of the histories of process and relational thinking, where the Hegelian tradition would actually be quite important to understanding some parts of cybernetics. And Bateson leaves, in particular, I like reading Bateson and Marx together, and Bateson leaves a lot of clues about that. And there's,
Oh, we're going to Okay, yeah, so all of those things can also be happening at the same time, right? So when you're designing or you're in a conversation, there are aspects that are, one sense or more sense of recursive. They also might be error correcting. They also might be part-whole movements and so on. So these things are kind of combined in the same process as well as kind of organized in different ways. And I think it'd be nice to kind of work through the kind of formal aspects of that in a kind of simple, relatively simple way. And John, we just got a couple of minutes left, so I don't know if you'd like to...
I'll do it super quick, just to do that very last bit. Do you want
to just go on to the next one?
Yeah. All it was is when we were having some dialogues about this, and it was that the circularity question, we were already thinking at quite an abstract level. We were thinking about abstract form and applying that to things. And so it was partly then thinking, well, there's actually a bigger history, again, of these various histories of engaging with circular. All around the world, one of the first things they do once they have enough excess to start building things is they start building circles. And then positioning themselves in relationship to the circular horizon around them. There's the various other traditions of working with other circles. The mandalas have already been referenced various times today, and Bateson, of course, said that mandalas and ecologies are almost the same thing. There's some interesting, so interesting in these kind of ways in which they're embodied. And then the ways in which all the diagrams that we've been seeing in the previous slides have this very particular formal language of lines and arrows. But if we start thinking about where does that come from, that partly comes from the very particular embodied traditions that of mid-20th century work that cybernetics in part emerged out of around working with electronics and electrics. And the fact that the abstraction of drawing lines and arrows is a fairly viable metaphor of the kind of thin extruded copper wire. But that then becomes a very powerful abstraction, which we then start to use for much, much more abstract and dispersed things which are circular in some ways, but then we think about it. So just to jump forward, there's always that wants to end with a little provocation of, if the embodied practices were actually trying to describe something like, whale sounds in water or just, something simply like this, how would we draw that? And would drawing it in different ways give us some different metaphors for thinking about these things that we're calling circular?
Thank you, everyone.